The Black Dahlia Murder. The rain-soaked streets of Los Angeles always had a way of cleansing the filth that accumulated in this city of angels. But no amount of rain could wash away the bloodstains that haunted my mind. The year was 1947, and the city was still reeling from the gruesome discovery of Elizabeth Short's mutilated body. The press had dubbed her the Black Dahlia, a name that echoed through every smoky bar and dingy alleyway. For the past few months, I'd been chasing shadows, trying to piece together the fragments of a shattered life. Elizabeth was an enigma, a young woman with dreams that were as dark as the secrets she kept. And now, those secrets had cost her everything. But it wasn't just the brutality of the crime that kept me awake at night. It was the feeling that something darker, something otherworldly was at play. My name is Detective Henry Lawson, and I've seen my share of horrors, but nothing prepared me for what lay ahead. It all started with a phone call, the kind of call that sends a shiver down your spine before you even answer it. The voice on the other end was raspy, almost inhuman, and it whispered a name that I hadn't heard in years, Elizabeth Short. The voice didn't belong to any of the usual suspects or informants. It was something else, something wrong. "Meet me at the alley off 39th Street, midnight, come alone." I should have ignored it, but something pulled me in. A morbid curiosity, perhaps. Or maybe it was the desperation of a man who had lost everything except the obsession to solve one last case. I grabbed my coat, the weight of my revolver pressing against my side as I stepped into the rain-soaked night. The alley was a forgotten corner of the city, a place where only the damned dared to tread. The smell of decay clung to the air, and the shadows seemed to dance with a life of their own. I waited, the echo of my own heartbeat filling the silence, when I saw her. A woman standing at the end of the alley, her figure barely visible in the dim light. She was dressed in black, her face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. But there was something familiar about her, something that made my blood run cold. As I approached, the air grew heavy, oppressive, and a sense of dread settled over me. "Who are you?" I demanded, my hand hovering over my gun. She lifted her head, and the sight of her face nearly stopped my heart. It was Elizabeth Short, but not as I remembered her. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, those eyes were black voids, empty and endless. "Henry," she whispered, her voice like a distant echo. "You can't save me." My blood turned to ice as her form began to flicker, like a candle about to be snuffed out. I reached out, but my hand passed right through her, as if she were made of smoke, and then she was gone. I stood there in the darkness, my mind reeling. Had I just seen a ghost? Or was it my own madness manifesting before me? The line between reality and nightmare had begun to blur, and I wasn't sure which side I was on anymore. But one thing was clear, I was in too deep. The Black Dahlia wasn't just a case anymore. It was a curse, and I was bound to it, unable to escape its grasp. As I turned to leave, a chill ran down my spine. There, scrawled on the wall in what looked like blood, were the words, "Find the truth, Henry, before it finds you." I stumbled back, the message burning itself into my memory. The rain started to pour again, washing away the blood, but not the terror that had settled deep within me. The city was no longer just a backdrop for a gruesome murder. It was a living, breathing entity, and it was hungry for more. And I had the sinking feeling that it wasn't finished with me yet. Sleep had become a luxury I could no longer afford. My mind was a carousel of fragmented images. Elizabeth's ghostly face, the blood-stained message on the wall, and the voice on the phone that started it all. Every time I closed my eyes, I was plunged into a world where reality twisted into something dark and sinister. But I had to keep going. The truth was out there, hidden in the shadows of this cursed city. The next day, I went back to the precinct, trying to shake off the fog of the previous night. The place was buzzing with the usual chaos. Officers scurrying around, phones ringing off the hook, the smell of stale coffee in the air. But none of it felt real, like I was moving through a dream I couldn't wake up from. My partner, Frank Donovan, was already at his desk, his face buried in a stack of files. Frank was the kind of guy who had seen it all, but never let it get to him. He looked up as I walked in, his eyes narrowing. "You look like hell, Henry," he said, a hint of concern in his voice. "Feel like it too," I muttered, collapsing into my chair. "Anything new on the Dahlia case?" Frank sighed, rubbing his temples. "Nothing we didn't already know. The usual dead ends. But something's off, Henry. I can feel it. This case, it's different." "Tell me about it," I said, my mind flashing back to the encounter in the alley. But I couldn't bring myself to tell Frank what had happened. He wouldn't believe me. And even if he did, what could he do? This was my burden to bear. Instead, I buried myself in the files, poring over every detail of Elizabeth Short's life. She was a drifter, moving from one place to another, chasing a dream that always seemed just out of reach. Her death had been brutal. Her body cut in half, drained of blood, her face carved into a grotesque smile. The work of a madman or something worse. But the more I read, the more I felt like I was missing something. like the pieces of the puzzle didn't quite fit. And then I found it. A name buried in the margins of one of the reports. A name I hadn't seen in years. It led me to a seedy bar on the outskirts of the city. The kind of place where forgotten souls went to drown their sorrows. The bartender gave me a wary look as I walked in, but I ignored him, heading straight for the back. And there he was, Michael Corrigan, a lowlife with a penchant for trouble. He was hunched over a table, nursing a drink, his eyes darting around the room like a cornered rat. "Corrigan," I said, taking a seat across from him. "We need to talk." He looked up, his face pale as a sheet. "Lawson, what the hell are you doing here?" "I'm looking for answers," I said, leaning in close. "And you're going to give them to me." Corrigan gulped, his hands trembling. "I don't know nothing, man. I'm out of the game." "Bullshit!" I snapped, grabbing him by the collar. "You knew Elizabeth Short. You were seen with her a week before she was murdered." His eyes widened in fear, and I knew I had him. Okay, he stammered. "I knew her, but I swear I didn't have nothing to do with what happened to her. She was scared, man. Said someone was after her." "Who?" I demanded, my grip tightening. "I don't know!" he cried, his voice rising in panic. "She wouldn't say, but there was something strange about her, like she knew more than she was letting on. She kept talking about a shadow that was following her, something that wasn't human." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean, not human?" "I don't know!" Corrigan pleaded. "But she was terrified. Said it would come for her if she didn't do what it wanted. I thought she was just crazy, man, but now what?" I pressed. He hesitated, glancing around as if he expected the shadow to appear at any moment. "Now I think she was right. I've been seeing things, hearing things, like it's coming for me too." Before I could ask anything else, the lights in the bar flickered and a low rumble echoed through the room. The patrons looked around nervously, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Corrigan's eyes widened in terror, and he bolted from his seat, knocking over his drink in the process. "I'm out of here, man. I ain't sticking around to find out what happens next." "Corrigan, wait." I called after him, but it was too late. He was already out the door, disappearing into the night. I sat there, the darkness closing in around me, the sense of dread growing stronger. Whatever was haunting Elizabeth Short had now set its sights on me, and I had no idea how to stop it. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that every step I took was leading me deeper into a trap. The encounter with Michael Corrigan had only heightened my paranoia, and the words he left me with, about the shadow that wasn't human, echoed in my mind like a sinister mantra. I needed answers, but every lead was a dead end. Every clue a piece of a puzzle that seemed to shift and change before my eyes. It was as if the case itself was alive, toying with me, pulling me into its twisted web. But I wasn't about to back down. Not now. Not after coming this far. There was one place left to check, one final lead that had been nagging at the back of my mind. An address I had found scrawled in the margins of Elizabeth Short's diary. An address she had visited just days before her murder. It was a long shot, but it was all I had. The address led me to an old, decrepit mansion on the outskirts of the city. The kind of place that had seen better days, but was now a crumbling relic of a bygone era. The windows were boarded up, the garden overgrown, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. As I approached, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into a place that time had forgotten. A place that held secrets best left buried. The door creaked open with a push, revealing a grand foyer shrouded in darkness. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the stench of rot. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the gloom, revealing faded portraits of long-dead faces staring down at me with hollow eyes. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the shadows seemed to twist and writhe as if they had a life of their own. As I made my way deeper into the mansion, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I could hear whispers, faint, indistinct, as if they were coming from the walls themselves. The temperature dropped, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my brow. My heart pounded in my chest as I rounded a corner and found myself standing before a door at the end of a long hallway. The door was slightly ajar, a dim light seeping out from the crack. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. Something about this door felt wrong, like crossing this threshold would change everything, like there was no going back. But I had to know. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was a study, filled with dusty old books and faded photographs. But it wasn't the room that caught my attention. It was the figure sitting at the desk, hunched over a pile of papers. "Elizabeth," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't move. It was a woman, her back to me, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders. I took a step closer, my heart in my throat. "Elizabeth?" I called out again, louder this time. She turned slowly and my blood ran cold. It wasn't Elizabeth. It was someone else. Someone with hollow, sunken eyes and a face twisted in agony. The woman's lips parted in a grotesque smile, and she let out a low, raspy laugh that sent chills down my spine. "You're too late," she whispered, her voice a sickening blend of pleasure and pain. It's already begun. I staggered back, my mind reeling. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, closing in on me, suffocating me. And then I saw it. A figure in the corner of the room, hidden in the darkness, watching me with eyes that gleamed like fire. It was the shadow. It moved toward me, slowly at first, but then it lunged, its form twisting and contorting as it reached out for me with claw-like hands. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering wildly as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The shadow was alive, its form shifting between human and something far more monstrous. I ran, my heart pounding in my chest as I fled down the hallway, the sound of the shadow's laughter echoing in my ears. The mansion seemed to warp and change around me, the hallways stretching endlessly, the doors slamming shut before I could reach them. It was as if the house itself was trying to trap me, to consume me. I could feel the shadow closing in, its presence suffocating, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I burst through the front door, gasping for breath as I stumbled into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap to the face, but I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. The shadow was nowhere to be seen, but I could still feel it, lurking in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike. I drove away as fast as I could, the mansion disappearing in the rearview mirror. But the fear didn't leave me. It clung to me like a second skin, suffocating me, driving me to the brink of madness. I knew deep down that I was in too deep. The shadow wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it was coming for me, and I had no idea how to stop it. The drive back to the precinct was a blur. The city lights streaked by in a haze, and the rain pounded against the windshield, but none of it felt real. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. When I finally reached the precinct, I was soaked to the bone and trembling from the cold. The place was quieter than usual, the night shift officers barely glancing up as I walked in. Frank Donovan was waiting for me at my desk, his expression grave. "Henry," he said, his voice low, "we need to talk." I didn't have the energy to argue. I sank into my chair, staring at the wall as Frank pulled out a file and placed it in front of me. "What's this?" I asked, my voice hollow. "It's a file on Elizabeth Short," Frank said, his tone grim. "But there's something in here you need to see." I opened the file, my eyes scanning the familiar details. Her background, her last known whereabouts, the grisly details of her murder. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was a photograph, an old faded picture of Elizabeth, but she wasn't alone. Standing next to her was a man, his face partially obscured by shadow, but I recognized him instantly. It was me. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt the room spin around me. This can't be right," I stammered. "I never met her before the investigation. This has to be a mistake." Frank's expression was unreadable. "I don't know what to tell you, Henry, but this photo was taken 2 weeks before her murder." I shook my head, trying to make sense of it. "This is impossible. I would have remembered." "Would you?" Frank asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "Or is there something you're not telling me?" I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Memories flashed through my mind. Fragments of conversations, half-remembered faces, the feeling of being watched. And then it hit me. The shadow, the voice on the phone, the warnings that had haunted me since the beginning of this case. "Frank," I whispered, my voice trembling. I think I'm losing my mind." Frank's eyes softened, and he placed a hand on my shoulder. "You're not crazy, Henry. But there's something going on here. Something bigger than both of us." I looked up at him, fear gnawing at the edges of my sanity. "What do you mean?" Frank hesitated, then leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. "This case, it's cursed. Everyone who's gotten too close to it has ended up dead, or worse. There are things in this world we don't understand, and I think you've been pulled into something dark, something evil." A chill ran down my spine. "What do I do?" Frank sighed, his face etched with worry. "There's only one way out of this, Henry. You need to confront whatever it is that's been haunting you. Find out the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. But you can't do it alone." He handed me a slip of paper with an address on it. "There's someone who might be able to help you, a medium. Someone who deals with things like this. But be careful. Once you open this door, there's no closing it." I nodded, my hands shaking as I took the paper. "Thanks, Frank. I don't know if I can do this, but I have to try." The address led me to a small, unassuming house on the outskirts of the city. The air was thick with tension as I knocked on the door, my heart pounding in my chest. A moment later, the door creaked open, and an elderly woman with piercing eyes and a knowing smile stepped aside to let me in. "You're here about the Dahlia," she said, her voice soft but firm. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I replied, my voice barely audible. "I need to know the truth." She led me into a dimly lit room, filled with the scent of incense and the flicker of candlelight. "The truth is a dangerous thing, Detective. Are you sure you're ready for it?" I nodded, though every fiber of my being screamed to turn back, to run from whatever horrors awaited me. But I couldn't. I had to see this through. The medium took my hands in hers, her grip surprisingly strong. "Close your eyes," she instructed. "Let the darkness take you." I did, as she said. And immediately I felt a cold wind whip through the room, the candles flickering wildly as the shadows seemed to come alive. The air grew thick, heavy, and I could hear whispers, faint at first but growing louder, more insistent. They were calling my name, taunting me, dragging me deeper into the abyss. And then suddenly, I was no longer in the room. I found myself standing in a dark, foggy landscape, the air thick with the stench of death. The ground beneath my feet was wet and cold, and as I looked around, I realized I was standing in the very alley where Elizabeth Short's body had been found. But I wasn't alone. There, in the distance, I saw her. Elizabeth, her pale form barely visible through the fog. She was crying, her voice a haunting wail that sent chills down my spine. "Elizabeth!" I called out, running toward her. "I'm here! I'm going to help you!" But as I got closer, her figure began to change. The fog swirled around her, and her face twisted into something monstrous, something inhuman. She turned to face me, her eyes black voids, her mouth a gaping maw that screamed in agony. "You can't save me, Henry!" she shrieked, her voice a piercing wail that echoed through the night. "You're too late! It's already taken me!" I stumbled back, my heart racing as the fog closed in around me, suffocating me, choking me. The ground beneath me seemed to shift and crumble, and I fell, plunging into darkness. I woke up back in the medium's room, gasping for breath, my body drenched in cold sweat. The candles were out, the room silent, but I could still feel the presence of the shadow, lurking just beyond the edge of my consciousness. The medium's eyes were wide with fear as she released my hands. "It's not just the Dahlia, Detective. It's you. The shadow. It's part of you." I stared at her in horror, the truth crashing down on me like a tidal wave. All this time, the shadow that had been haunting me, the darkness that had consumed Elizabeth, it was me. I was the monster, the thing that had taken her life, and now it was coming for me. I staggered to my feet, the weight of the revelation crushing me. What do I do?" The medium's voice was barely a whisper. "There's nothing you can do, Henry. It's too late. The darkness has already won." And then before I could react, the shadows in the room surged forward, consuming everything in their path. The medium let out a blood-curdling scream as the darkness engulfed her, and I could feel it closing in on me, suffocating me, dragging me down into the abyss. I tried to fight it, tried to claw my way back to the light, but it was no use. The darkness was too strong, too powerful. It wrapped around me like a shroud, and I felt my consciousness slip away, consumed by the very thing I had been chasing all along. The last thing I heard before the darkness claimed me was a voice, cold and distant, whispering in my ear, "The truth, Henry. You found it, and now it will find you." The end.